Okay, so it's Jamie Pringle here again. So I'll just give you a little brief introduction to what forensic geoscience is. This unfortunate individual is a victim in the Eastern Europe Bosnian civil wars or Balkan civil wars in the 1990s. Obviously, see where it is on the surface. That's obviously a little bit easier to find than buried individuals or objects, which is more where we're coming from. Okay, so what is forensic geoscience? It's not people, that's forensic pathology. You've got to do a medical degree first and then carry on and do the pathology side. Grave investigations tends to be forensic archaeology, autophonomy. CSI stuff, you probably realise a lot of that either is made up or time frames really compressed. Some people do mark spots where they leave things for whatever reason. So sometimes, but not that usual X marks the spot. So forensic geoscience is really looking at geological, environmental information and methods of investigations which come before a court of law. So that's sort of the key factor there. It's a sort of Pinecroft definition, and it's not just rocks; it's also sediments, soils, dust, minerals, microfossils, and non-invasive stuff, remote sensing, and geophysics as well. So it's not all just about rocks and fossils. And certainly in this part of the course, we're going to be splitting into either search, as in looking for an object or people or whatever, or then trace evidence when you've actually recovered items of interest and you want to try and find some evidential match or not a match perhaps from two different areas or two objects or whatever. And it's certainly a multidisciplinary area, and of course experts should keep within their area of specialty. So here I'm on the geophysics on that top left side of things, sort of physical properties of the ground, geophysics literally. You have geochemists though, looking for chemical changes. You have biologists who look at sort of biogeochemists, palynology, that's microfossils, old fossils, entomology, so living insects. You've got engineering side, for example, fatal accident investigators, medical, as I've mentioned, and archaeology as well if you're looking at recovery. So certainly a lot of different experts can get involved in these sort of investigations depending upon what the case is about. All of them are unique. They have different sites, different soil types, different case example. You know what happened, what went missing with individuals, for example. So it can get quite complex, and that will depend upon which person you're going to try and or people who could try to be involved in that case. Where is this coming from? Well, certainly it's over 100 years old. Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame was talking about accumulated layers of soil on someone's trousers to see where they'd actually travelled. So that's one sort of simple method. Germans very organised. Hans Gross published a geoscience handbook, how to use that in sort of evidential areas in the 1890s. And George Popp actually used an early case in the 1900s, linking an unusual mineral in the soil called hornblende, linked it to a strangulation case. Margaret Filbert was found there, actually linking that to the individual, I think. In other UK more famous recent cases, Aldo Moro, he was a ex-Italian prime minister. He's actually kidnapped and murdered. He actually found his body in the back of a car boot with some sand on it, and they analysed the sand samples and found they were from a beach. In fact, that wasn't actually where he was killed. It's actually a plant planted there by the kidnappers. Louis Mountbatten, who's Prince Charles's uncle, or was Prince Charles's uncle, was blown up on his yacht in the late 1970s by part of the IRA. Actually, sand and paint flecks were used as evidence on the individuals who were charged with his murder to link them to the crime scene site. Lastly, Stephanie Slater, who was a estate agent in Birmingham, was kidnapped. Ransom notes was attached to this particular brick, I think left on the M6 or the M1, which is later, it's an unusual brick, in fact, unfortunately for the kidnapper. It's actually linked to where it was actually delivered to, where he was actually holding it. Other cases you might have heard of: Ian Huntley, this is sort of the Soham murders, where these two girls were kidnapped and murdered. Actually, he was a janitor at school, and they actually impounded his car. He'd cleaned the car, but hadn't actually cleaned under the car. So under this car arch was some bits of chalk containing microfossils linked to a specific area in Suffolk where they actually used that as evidence material. There's also botanical evidence to suggest he'd actually gone there twice, once to whatever reason, to dump the bodies in another time at some point later in the season. But you can change and look at the palynological evidence. So again, there's a link there if you want to read about that in more detail. A classic case, a cold case, so sort of an unsolved murder. So every 10 years or so, if a murder's been unsolved, police cold case officers will look at that, revisit it. Is there any more information? That's why you often see it coming up in the news, actually, every so often. You think, oh, why's that old one happened? Because it's going to be on a 10-year basis. Has there been new techniques been evolved to help with it? Is it going to jog people's memories, etc., etc.? This was one in New Zealand, looking for a lady called Yvonne who had been missing for 12 years. And they've actually narrowed it down to a relatively small search area in the woodland in New Zealand, as you can see here with the map. So they actually looked at conductivity methods, so geophysical methods, to see if they could locate where she was. You see the little blobs in here, sort of dark black blobs are low conductivity, I think, and white are high conductivity. And they then did some follow-up second phase of radar to confirm if there's an object buried there or not. And she was actually found in that sort of top left area, as you can maybe see. And in fact, soil types are quite important. So all soils are very unique, with different amounts of clay, sand and silt with it, as well as artificial materials, perhaps, other natural materials, vegetation, etc., etc. So it can be quite unusual depending upon what's in there. And so certainly more rare elements, some so-called exotic minerals, may be able to give it a more definitive match of material if it's been used for evidence purposes. It's a bit more tricky in urban areas compared to rural soils, because there's a lot more variability in urban areas. So we've been involved with trying to classify different local town soils, for example, called the Soil Fit Project, which I'll tell you about later. Peter Tobin, that's an interesting case. So he was in prison for murder of a Polish teenager, I think. We buried her under a school church floorboards in Scotland. And working back from where he used to live, police started looking at other missing cases. Margate in Kent is one of his previous properties, which you can see here on the top right of this plot. And the neighbours who still lived there, actually, when he lived there, said he actually built a patio and a fish tank or fish pond in the middle of the night for some reason. So it was a bit weird. So the police actually the Met Police at that time had a forensic geophysics team, sadly now been disbanded due to budget cuts, but they'd actually collected a radar survey, found some anomalous anomalies basically under those two sites, digged carefully down and found the dismembered remains of these two girls who'd went hitchhiking for music festivals in the early 1990s. And they even found, because they're careful, they found the bloody thumbprint of Peter's on some of those bags containing their bodies. So he got sentenced for murder for those two killings as well. Again, there's a link there if you want to read for more information. This one's an interesting case. So this was a frogman diving in one of which reservoir it was, the Lake District, and found this skeleton which had been weighed down in one of these lakes, and they'd actually used DNA to find out who this person was. And apparently it was this female victim whose husband said she'd run off 20 plus years before. Difficult to say how that to disprove that, although the sandstone cobbles which were weighing the victim down were actually quite unusual. So here's some thin sections of those cobbles, and also from a household garden. So B and C, as you can hopefully see, have got sort of similar sized grains, colours, all there in grayscale in this example, compared to the control sample, which is the top one. So they actually used that evidence to help convict the husband of her murder. You can read more about that in the Ruffle paper if you wish. So some cold cases are successful, a lot of them aren't. It's very low success rate. So how do people try and improve that? Well, one method some people use is to create in controlled environments, so either on a test site or a known area, and actually try and simulate targets and then try and find them again. It's obviously slightly cheap because they know where they are, but they can try and use different techniques, different equipment configurations, maybe sample size positions to try and work out what's going to be best or most effective, or most time and cost effective, actually, because a lot of cases are constrained by the budget. Certainly cold cases don't have a budget associated with them, so that's why they're a bit more tricky to solve. Active cases do. I'll tell you more about that in the law enforcement part. We can't use humans to do these simulations due to the Human Tissue Act, unlike in a lot of other countries. So you'll have heard of the body farm in the US. That's not the only one using donated human cadavers for forensic experiments. There's got at least 5 in the US. There's a couple opened up in Canada, one in Australia recently, and one in Amsterdam, actually the first one in Europe last year. So we can't do that though. So we use either you can use plastic skeletons type thing, which I've done that before, or you use some sort of animals as sort of a proxy type thing for humans. And they're quite useful, and for things like time since death. Can you detect where they might be if you bury them and try and find them again, and geophysical studies. And this is a classic 1962 sort of decomposition of pig video, which I'll just briefly talk over. And why do we use pigs? Well, they're got similar tissue type to humans, got the similar body size, organs, similar skin, hair type. So actually they're quite good analogues for humans. And in fact, you can get more of them than a donated human, which will be the same, and the pigs will be the same age, size, weight, diet, for example. So you certainly donated human cadavers, which the medics at Keele, for example, can cut up. We've actually got a human donation register at Keele. We can't use them for forensic purposes. And certainly we know the decomposition stages of them. We can relate that to humans quite well. So you have a look at that video in a bit more detail. That's why it's just died. And here's an example of a simulated site. So this is actually the back of Staffordshire University's crime scene house, which is down near the Stoke-on-Trent station. There's me looking a bit more youthful. And you can see in the garden there, we've set out a specified survey area by that yellow triangle. We've buried a pig, in fact, 2 pigs you can probably see as highlighted here. And you can actually see the ground's a bit more, or the grass over them a little bit greener. You can say that's because they're being more fertilised, I guess, a bit grizzly, but that's another point you can look for, different vegetation changes, by the way. As well as maybe surface depressions, because over time the soil over the carcass will contract due to both going back to backgrounds, sort of porosities and permeabilities, but also as the carcass sort of chest cavity collapses, it creates a bit more of a gap, by the way, if that's of interest. And we could use any sort of technique. This one's using resistivity, going along set survey lines. You can see here I'm on the first one, and you just sequentially do all of the survey lines and then create a grid of data afterwards. And then you can play around with looking at what's the best sample size you can get away with to find it. Does it change over time? Can you look at the background soil, water, and see what that looks like? So again, there's quite a bit of work you can do with those things. It's not all about terrestrial, by the way. A lot of people get dumped in water. In fact, only 10% of burials are on land, 30% are in structures, and sort of 60% are in water. And Emiliano Sala's disappearance in 2019 is a good example of that. They were pretty sure where, obviously, where he went off from. They had a flight path. There's sort of some timings, and they knew roughly when the plane went down in the sea. They then looked at things like tide tables, the storms, the sort of wind direction to get a rough search area sorted out. And they then uses a dedicated research vessel to survey within that. You can see on the bottom right plot sort of the grid of surveys that they use. So using sort of side scan sonar systems, I'll tell you about. And again, it was pretty impressive actually. You can see actually where they found their sort of sunken aircraft with, unfortunately, Emiliano's remains inside it. It's pretty good. You see where that was within the search area. They also helped by flotsam and jetsam of bits of the plane coming on shore, as you can see with that photo. So again, that's quite effective. Again, there's a link there for looking at more about how they actually did that. Other things to think about: forensic botany. So that's quite useful methods. So sort of thinking not just plants, but things like spores and pollen as well. That's a bit more maybe palynology. Not so much in this schematic top right example, slightly unlikely. Someone's been buried, the tree grows over it, you cut the tree down, we look at the tree rings, and that's got to be a minimum time that they've been missing for. But more for things like what kind of plants were there, or we can't be near this plant because this plant's taken 50 years to grow and it's only been missing 10 years, so it can't be around this spot, for example. Seasonality is quite important as well. When do they go missing? Can you detect that through sort of spores and pollen? On the bottom right, we wonder what the torso is there. That's example of Adam torso. This Nigerian torso of a young individual which was found floating down the Thames in 2001. Still unsolved. They're actually looking at what the last meal of the victim was and trying to work out what that might be. Entomology. that's certainly an area of growing interest using insects. That's more sort of less geoscience and more sort of bio geoscience, I guess. But they're really useful, looking at things like post-mortem interval, when someone might have died, where they died. Certain insects live in certain habitats. Has it been moved or stored since death? People put them in freezers and then move them elsewhere, or where they've been actually stabbed. If it's been decomposed, where is that? You can see where the trauma sites might be, and other more nefarious reasons as well. So that's only a useful area of forensic interest. Other sort of things, remote sensing. So that's quite an important area. So it's only a good area for employment as well, actually, if that's of interest. Trying to analyse things like satellite data and also aircraft or even helicopter and drone data is all remote sensing. For simple things like this, for this example, sort of traffic accident reconstructions, trying to look at braking speeds and angles and what might have happened. It's sort of fairly robust in court. You can actually see it, everything in that. That's quite a useful method to give the prosecutors additional evidence, and it's hard to sort of disprove that in court. Also, more other things like art fraud. People used geoscientists for that as well, and they maybe look at things like the paint in these, and are they actually true or not? So for this example, this was a Russian painter, I think, and they see whether it's a real a new one suddenly appeared on the market, and actually Macron Associates, which is a geoscientist firm, actually analysed the samples and actually found this particular paint was titanium white in sort of mineral form, but actually the date would put it about 10 years too late for the actual artist. Again, saying it's not actually true. So to read a bit more information, there's a basic sort of small book, Milsom and Erickson. There's various examples of that. I think I put a link online for you to have a read about. So some basic theory and some examples of geophysical methods. Your textbook is this Geoforensics 2008 Ruffle and McKinley one. That's really good. It's quite easy read, and there's lots of cases in there, so that's well worth thumbing through. And then a more of a coffee table book is sort of Ray Murray's Evidence from the Earth. It's very US based, but there's also some good stuff in there. Other sort of articles, there are academic journal articles. These are a couple of review papers I've been involved with, but they're also quite good. So Alistair's led up the aquatic forensic search paper in her Science Review. I did the terrestrial one a few years before that, so that gives you sort of different sections. You'll need some of that for your review. There's also some Geology Society of London special publications on sort of environmental geoforensics. There's a few actually, so I've just listed the most recent one, as well as that first book that I told you about. Don't forget, we've spent quite a lot of time putting your online resources together, both on the VLE and increasingly so on the Microsoft Teams. So do have a little flick through that. There's lots of things to help with your practical, your in-course assessments, and also how to do stuff, and some reading lists as well. So do read through all that.